I am Devin. I'm the developer advocate here at EdgeDB, and I'm here with Elvis. Would you like to introduce yourself, Elvis?
Hi everybody, I'm Elvis, co-founder and CTO here. So, got deep technical questions about HDB. Now is the time to ask.
Awesome. Glad to have you. And thanks everyone in the audience for joining us. Let me see. Housekeeping items. We've still got EdgeDB Cloud Beta ongoing. If anyone does not have access and you want access, you can request that through the cloud channel here on Discord. Or if you're watching this after the fact on YouTube and you don't want to join the Discord, you can request it through our website. The button at the top of the page on the navigation, you can join the waitlist there. All right, we are ready to answer questions. So if you have anything, feel free to either raise your hand, we'll bring you up on stage, or you can post those in the text chat and we will pull some out of there and answer them there. I could ask a couple of questions if you don't mind, just to fill time where we're waiting on users to pose their questions.
Go
Uh,
ahead.
I asked you just earlier, Elvis, about putting an order by clause on a backlink, and I think you said that it's not possible yet. And I took that to mean it's something that we're working towards, that we want to make possible in the future.
Yes, it's basically it's not that it is impossible to put an order by clause on something. It is possible to put it on everything,
Yeah.
uh, as long as you wrap your expression in with a select,
Okay.
right? So
Yeah.
you can put a select and then attach. And you can nest selects, of course, making those essentially a subquery inside a subquery, and that's supported right now, and you can
Mm-hmm.
do that no problem. What we've been talking about internally is that it isn't actually necessary from the grammar standpoint to require you to write a select, and so we're contemplating transforming uh, the filter clause and the order by clause from actually being clauses to look more like operators instead. You can
Okay.
basically append your filter or your order by to any expression and have it sorted or filtered without having to wrap the whole thing in a select and parenthesis. So basically making your queries less noisy that way. And that's
Yeah.
already occasionally supported in certain parts of the grammar, like the shapes, the nested shapes,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and in function calls. Um, so basically the idea is that we'll just go and generalize that and make it just part of normal expressions instead.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. That.
it makes a lot of sense if you look at how update um, and delete statements are specified, right? Right
Mm-hmm.
now, if you look at delete something, filter something, what you should be looking at is, oh, delete this set represented by this expression, where expression is something filtered by something, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's like it makes sense to interpret these that way as opposed to some um, arbitrary order of clauses, which in the case of delete makes doesn't make a lot of sense
Yeah.
because like originally and like our design, one of the design considerations we had when we were constructing the grammar for HQL initially was that you should be able to read your queries top to bottom,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's not like SQL where you need to basically jump around and like look, oh, where's my data coming from? Am I
Mm-hmm.
filtering it? How am I grouping it? How am I sorting it? It's all like kind of messed up because like it's a basic declaration and it's you can't read it top to bottom. in many cases, especially when the query is complex. So with HQL, it's more of a top to bottom approach. So you select, then you filter, then you sort. Likewise with group, you select, then you group, then you do the transformation on the grouped set some sort. That's the idea there.
Yeah, I think my confusion around it stemmed from the fact that you can put them in a shape. You can put them on a link inside a shape, and that's really handy. So yeah, it'd be super cool to have that capability in other contexts too.
Yeah.
All right. Looks like we have our first question. Curious if we can take a look at this project, PachaDB, and discuss how it could be used with EdgeDB potentially as a cache of EdgeDB content on top of Cloudflare Workers platform, or if it's better to just use Redis for caching queries. Is this project something that you're familiar with, Elvis?
Not off the top of my head, no. But I can take a look later if I have a. It's not the only such thing. It's been there's another popular caching framework, though the name slips my mind, that was popping up periodically. Yeah, I mean, EdgeDB is not fundamentally different from any other database, relational or not. If you want like a separate caching framework or caching infrastructure in front of HTTP, caching query results, or doing some other type of caching, then it's no different from, say, using Postgres directly. With the caveat that depending on how well integrated that, how much automation that caching framework provides, you might need to write some HTTP specific integration for it, which should be straightforward. I guess it's the same idea. You make a query that has certain query text, has certain arguments, and then you cache results based on the query and the arguments. Cache invalidation obviously is always the elephant in the room. How do you do that? But if it's like time-based invalidation, then it's fairly straightforward. We do plan to implement certain, I wouldn't call them caching strategies, but rather materialization strategies in HDB itself. Like with so right now you can do a little bit of that already with mutation rewrites, where you can effectively materialize some computed and record it as a normal property. So we can basically formalize that and introduce a concept of stored computeds with some form of cache invalidation, of that stored value, essentially. So there's like a very big conceptual project about introducing more data flow analysis to schema-mined queries, where certain mutations of some objects somewhere affect some state of other objects, which is it's a difficult problem in general, but in certain slice of it we can implement effectively, and this will let us also do things like implementing proper constraints that traverse links Because right now constraints are limited to essentially in their what they can reach to the immediate object, right? Object and its properties and single links, because single links are stored in object. But as soon as you try to traverse and reach into a linked object saying, hey, the length of the name of that linked object must be this, then suddenly you cannot use that constraint. And that's mostly because the underlying implementation right now uses straightforward Postgres constraints without any sort of help from the compiler. Let's put it this way. You can emulate some of that with access policies and rewrites and triggers, these what we call super constraints, and they're not really constraints, they're just a way to specify certain behaviors at the mutation time of one object, but not the other. So they're not really constraints.
Yeah. So is that the ticket that we have that is about reworking? Oh, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. You were talking about. Oh, you were talking about constraints. So is the sort of reworking of constraints, is that more, is that about implementing more on the EdgeDB side and relying less on Postgres constraints, or just supplementing what Postgres gives us with stuff on our side?
It's both, right? It's because Postgres' constraints don't support multiple relations in a constraint. They constrain a single relation. So as soon as you start like traversing links and doing some sort of aggregation and whatnot, then suddenly that doesn't work. Yeah. But we can do it in queries, in your mutation queries, by inserting validation at mutation time in your query, which would effectively, the queries are much less constrained about what they can contain. And that's how we already implement conflict clauses and a bunch of other stuff that isn't in Postgres. It's in your queries, the compiler part.
Gotcha. Yep. I'm going to, we've got a user that wants to come up on the stage to ask a question, so I'm going to skip to that, and then I'll come back to some of the chat questions.
Okay.
So let's go ahead here. All right, you should be able to come up on the stage now. Yeah, maybe while they're doing that, we can look at one of these other chat questions. The new property graph syntax of SQL 2023, could it add something new to EdgeDB if it gets implemented in Postgres?
Not really. What the property graph syntax in the new SQL standard does, it basically brings in a version of Cypher, which is a Neo4j graph syntax into SQL. And what most of what it does is what EdgeQL already does, in a sense that it replaces joins with like a formal definition of a link or a graph edge, and then you can write expressions traversing those edges without writing actual joins, right? So it's kind of like a simplification. There is nothing there. It's just a syntax sugar. There is nothing there that you couldn't do with normal SQL. And yeah, it's basically just syntax sugar. It's still SQL. It's still constrained to flat results. So even though you might traverse the graph and say your where clause or in your computation expression, you're still limited to returning a flat tuple, so you can't do like nested shapes like EdgeDB does. So yeah, there's nothing really there. Oh, it's great to see, some movement acknowledging that application data models are graphs, and that people don't want to write the same type of join all over again, over and over and over. So to me, it seems like an acknowledgement of this fact, which is, what graph relational and HQL are all about.
Sounds like our users having trouble getting on the stage from the mobile app, so we may just take their question over chat if they're able to get it there. In the meantime, came across PG later, and it made me wonder. I assume all EdgeDB queries are all async already, and then also curious of how the job of PG later is done in EdgeDB. I guess by the query engine.
Right. So I think there is a little bit of confusion here about async as a client interface to the database, where you can like issue queries asynchronously and like use some asynchronous framework to issue queries concurrently and like wait for a bunch of results. It's not the same as something like PG later, because if I'm not mistaken, what PG later does is it schedules the execution of some query, and then it uses some form of message queue to communicate the results. So basically, like it's like a batch job. You send it to the server, and then you forget about it. Like you might even disconnect. Though I'm not sure. I haven't used PG later, but that's my impression of what it does. And it could be useful in scenarios where the query is super slow, like in some analytical query or something like that analysis. That you just fire and forget, and then when it's done, it's done. We could implement something similar in EdgeDB. In fact, it would probably be a lot easier to do than what PG later is doing, simply because like HTTP is already a separate piece from Postgres, and it could be part of something we can take into account while implementing the side effectful triggers, or basically like messaging integration, because that's one of the things that we plan on adding to HTTP at some point, possibly quite soon, is the ability to emit events from the database. Right? So imagine you add some form of trigger on some object saying, hey, if this thing changes, send this piece of JSON to this web hook, or post an event to like a message queue, like Kafka or something like that. The challenge there is that all of that needs to factor in that needs to consider transactions, right? So that side effect of emitting something with that data needs to only happen when the transaction that it contains successfully commits. Otherwise, you might end up with like data inconsistency and like generating events from something that didn't actually happen. So this PG later like functionality might be part of that, or could piggyback on that implementation.
This is maybe slightly related to that. I got a question earlier in the Discord about triggering something to happen in the database on some sort of timer, like basically a cron task that lives inside the
Mhm.
database. As far as I know, there's no way to do that. Is that anything that
That's similar.
does that makes okay?
That's similar. Like the only difference is that instead of triggering that asynchronous query uh,
Mm-hmm.
manually or by some external trigger,
Yeah.
you would do it on a timer,
Yeah.
uh, which is a similar thing, and it wouldn't be much different from same idea essentially.
Okay.
And yeah, it's quite useful because you might do housekeeping uh, work inside your database. Like maybe like you have a bunch of data that you might want to roll up, like compress, make less, reduce resolution to reduce like storage requirements, which is common with something like storing metrics for something, or you might want to do some other sort of periodic task that looks at some data and maybe sends a notification somewhere or
Mm-hmm.
something like that, an event on a periodic basis. But yeah, it's a useful piece of functionality that people currently implement externally with external task management. Like in Python, there's like Celery and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm pretty sure like every platform has something like that. But then you need to poll your database
Mm-hmm.
or many things. So it's yeah, it's useful. We'll consider it.
Yeah. All right. We've got a question. This is text to voice. So let's see if we can decipher it. I'm not sure if it all came across as intended. Okay. So I think the gist of this question is maybe around region availability on cloud. I assume that's what we're talking about here. Is that what it looks like to you?
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, the issue is like the servers in the US and
Mm-hmm.
they're trying to act. Well, yeah, it's the general um, issue of latency. Like you can't
Mm-hmm.
work around it. You know, speed of light is speed of light. So if it takes like 200 or like even 300 milliseconds for a packet to reach a destination one way and then 300 more back, so you have basically like a 600 milliseconds round trip. Um, there is no way around it except moving the server closer to the client. But then if it's a database, then there's the whole problem of replicating data, um, and like it's hard. It's one of the hardest problems there is. Um, and we actually do a lot, already done a lot, and there is probably more work we can do with making sure the protocol doesn't do unnecessary round trips when you run a query. Um, yeah, but it basically boils down to making as few queries as possible, which you can totally do in HQL. I think also the question was a single edge client.
Mm.
Yeah. Um, yeah, that's it's interesting in a sense that we can also do something like that, where we basically run EdgeDB itself close to the client. You know, you're in Europe, your data is actually in the US, right? But you can run EdgeDB server in Europe. If your client doesn't support persistent connections, EdgeDB itself would be that persistent connection pool that we're talking about. So the cost of establishing the connection would be lower, of course, because establishing the connection, especially if it's a TLS connection, which all of them are by default, requires several round trips. And if all you do is just run one query and then disconnect, then of course that total latency would be quite high. But if you host your EdgeDB server close to where the clients are, even if your Postgres and your data is somewhere remote, that could definitely help with total latency. And that's something we will consider doing for in the cloud as well.
Is the replication problem you were talking about, is that something that we hope to ultimately address with cloud, or maybe it's pretty far off?
It's not a problem. It's a problem. It's just a hard thing to. There's a lot of complexity there that you just cannot magically solve. It's trade-offs because ultimately, again, you're constrained by the latency of the network. And so imagine you have like one server in the US and like a replica in Australia, which has like half a second delay just to, even if everything else is perfect, it takes half a second for that data to reach the replica. And if there's more latency on the way, it could reach into seconds. And if your data volume is quite high, then your replicas might start falling behind on data. So like, at what point do you consider them to actually be valid from the standpoint of actually returning correct data? Because there's also something like read-write consistency, right? If you write something, it's a whole thing. It's like consistency, availability, persistence, so-called cap theorem. So what we can do with EdgeDB is we can make it can and will make it easier for you to set it up and to expose these sort of trade-offs in a way that is understandable. So things like replica lag should be explicit. As a developer of an application, should be aware that, oh, even though I have like 5 replicas, my application is such, or like this query is such that it cannot afford having more than like 500 milliseconds of data lag, or it might not afford any lag at all, and I'm willing to accept that extra latency of going to the primary to fetch that data. So all of those things need to be factored into the API, which we already have thought about. So if you look at the design of our clients, you will see that there's this notion of configuring the client or configuring the transaction, like setting in options on it. When then you run queries, certain things happen, certain behaviors change. That's where things will happen. You would just say on this client or in this transaction, hey, by the way, this can or cannot tolerate read-only replicas, or like geographically distributed replicas, and that cool. Of course so translates to cloud.
Yeah, so you could be configuring clients individually per query based on what those queries will tolerate, and then the client will know what to do with that. Yeah. Okay. A follow-up on that response sounds promising. I was just exploring since I was traveling, and thanks for the response.
Yeah,
we have another. Yeah, definitely. We have another question here. A user came across a library, it looks like, called state charts. And they wonder if this can be used with EdgeDB, and would doing that be useful? I'm not familiar with this one. State charts interpreter for Postgres. Interpreter for state machines represented using state charts.
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you're asking if something like this can be used directly with HTTP, well, I'm not sure how it's implemented. If it's a Postgres extension of sorts, then maybe. But if it's an application that uses Postgres as a backend, then you would need to adapt it to HTTP, of course. But yeah, there's nothing nothing preventing you from implementing something like that in HTTP.
It looks like it connects to a Postgres database, and then it says that it will install functions in your database. So I'm assuming that that would not work out of the box.
Well, if
Not
it's
with our
installing,
SQL support, at least.
no. Yeah. Well, if it expects Postgres and Postgres schema, then of course it's not something that HTTP would let you do. You need to express the same in HTTP terms, and I suspect that it's gonna, if you were to go and implement something like that for HTTP, it would be a lot simpler to do, simply because of the schema, how the schema is organized, and we do have stored procedures as well, so it's possible.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like the whole thing is a little bit of a niche you need to have a good use case to implement something like this. State machines are great, but there might not be the right tool for every use case. Depends on the use case, of course.
All right. We've answered everything we have so far. Keep them coming if you have more questions. Here's another one. Just popped in. Has EdgeDB thought of making our own implementation of a vector store instead of relying on pgvector?
I mean, what's wrong with pgvector? It seems like it's a common point of effort, application of effort to adding vectors to Postgres. A lot of Postgres vendors have adopted pgvector, and so it's not standing still. They're adding new index types, like making it faster, more efficient, and so on. So unless there is something really, really wrong with pgvector, there is no reason for us to sort of duplicate that effort. And there's another consideration is that pgvector, because it has been adopted rapidly by vendors, means that you as an HTTP user, if you host your Postgres with someone else, say you're not using HTTP Cloud, and you want to use RDS or Google Cloud Postgres or whatever it is you're hosting your infrastructure on, like we can't really rely on extensions that aren't there. HTTP cannot install like a binary extension into the backend Postgres it runs on unless it manages the whole cluster, which wouldn't always be the case, especially in production.
The user's calling out a particular Postgres extension, PG vectors, that provides vector similarity search functions written in Rust. Is that so? Okay, related question, Elvis. Something like this extension, once we have sort of unlocked fully Postgres extension support, can you just grab anything like this and plug it into EdgeDB, or are there other sort of limiting factors that would keep that from working?
So, well, first of all, yes, you could, just like we plugged in pgvector. As we sort of go through this exercise of exposing third-party extensions through EdgeDB, we are adding more and more knobs and infrastructure to be able to define EdgeDB extensions on top of Postgres extensions. So 4.0, for example, would have a lot more in that department. For something else we're working on, there's also going to be full text search, probably not part of 4.0, but I mean, full text search will be part of 4.0, but only full text search that Postgres itself implements. But we're designing and implementing our full text search in such a way that you can bring in an extension like ZomboDB to offload that full text search to something like Elasticsearch. So there's a lot of infrastructure there that comes down to wrapping Postgres extensions. So basically what I'm trying to say is, yeah, we are working on making it easier to specify these extensions.
Okay. So maybe that addresses the user's concern there. You could.
Yeah, just to clarify, it's the way Postgres extensions work. It makes them difficult to package as part of EdgeDB, again, because it's a binary that you have to install on the machine that your Postgres is running on, right? It's like a dynamically linked library, and you need to tell Postgres where to look for it. A special bit of SQL that sort of does that when you create a Postgres extension. So it's that bit of physically shipping a binary to the Postgres server machine is what makes this whole thing difficult logistically, because it isn't just, oh, I have a bunch of interpreted code that I just upload to the server normally and it becomes an extension. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that with Postgres. So that bit of installing that Postgres extensions that step needs to be done by someone, either your provider, whoever's hosting your Postgres, or yourself if you're hosting it yourself. And then you can tell HDB, oh, hey, by the way, because that backend you're running on supports pgvector or pgvector vectors, you can enable this HDB extension. Because ultimately, the way HDB works, it relies on Postgres, right? So if it's a special kind of index, ultimately all those extensions just implement special kinds of indexes. The data type is trivial. It's just an array of floats, which isn't special. What is special is the index. So you're adding an index type to Postgres, and that is after you've added that index type to Postgres, you can then rely on it in your HDB schemas. Hope that sort of explains how it works.
Here's a good follow-up. Maybe does EdgeDB Cloud alleviate some of that problem that you were talking about of having to also add the binary to the Postgres install?
Well, we aren't like, so yes and no. It does alleviate some of the problems that we control how we host our Postgres, right? Because we are effectively hosting it for you. So someone comes in and says, oh, pretty please, we want this extension, and so on. We can build and make it available in our distribution of Postgres, and then you could write an HDB extension on top of that. But in the sense of logistics, it's the same thing, right? We would need to. the difficulty there isn't just, oh, you need to copy a certain file to a certain server. It's also you need to make sure that that extension was built specifically for this specific version of Postgres, because the ABI, Postgres ABI is not stable across versions, so you need to rebuild extensions for a specific Postgres, kind of like binary Python extensions, where you have like a build. If you have a binary extension for Python, you have builds for every Python version that you support. So it's kind of the same idea here. So yeah, possibly if this sort of becomes like a pressing issue where people want to bring in their own extensions, and like we have some sort of vetted process of enabling them, we might want to have some process of automating that. But again, since this is binary code running on your database server, it will be extremely unwise to like make it sort of user controllable, because you don't want to run arbitrary code on your database without like it going through the some review.
Yep, that makes sense. We probably have time for one more question. If anyone else has anything you'd like us to discuss on this call.
There's one more question about customization. The last one.
Oh, okay. There won't be a way to customize or tune an instance. Okay, yeah. The user's asking if all of EdgeDB Cloud Postgres instances are the same, and or if there will be some way to customize or tune an individual one.
Well, we do. EdgeDB does expose a configuration system, and part of that configuration, some of those configuration knobs reach into Postgres, and we'll be adding more to expose more of those. So there are certain things that you cannot customize because they're like administration specific to how that instance runs and how much compute resources it has, and so on and so forth. But within those constraints, there will be a way for you to specify configuration for your EdgeDB and for your Postgres, as long as it is one of the less configuration options. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Maybe we can do this one really quick too, Elvis. Is there a way to access the Postgres backend of an instance in EdgeDB Cloud?
No. Okay. And that's a deliberate decision because we don't want to expose too much for you to accidentally start to rely on that. That's an implementation detail essentially. And the reason for that isn't that, we don't want you to do that, but it's more of like we have creative ways of running Postgres, and those ways will be even more creative, that are specific to how to EdgeDB and to how we run our cloud. So yeah, we don't plan to expose Postgres directly that runs on the cloud. You can use SQL, the SQL port that is a very thin proxy to Postgres, but even thinner than HTTP itself. It still goes through translation, but the query is ultimately like whatever you wrote in your SQL query goes to Postgres. And like I said earlier, the configuration of the underlying Postgres is also going to be exposed to some extent. So it's like in a way, you can already establish like a pSQL, read-only pSQL connection to the underlying Postgres through this translation layer and do certain things. There are limitations there, of course, but you can do a lot already. So you can run certain administrative things, like query the stat views, like PG stat activity or like some other stats through that interface, if that's something you're interested in. So we wouldn't be restricting that too much. Yeah.
And just to clarify, this is not our SQL support. This is something apart from that.
This is.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Right? Because just the way our SQL support works is you write a SQL query, then we pass it through a translation layer to basically mangle the names of the relations you're referring to, because internally they're not named after your schema, they're named after the ID of the schema type. And there are technical reasons to why I would do it this way. But other than that, it's just the same SQL you would write and send to the underlying Postgres edges, and then it goes as is. There are some limitations around like the idea of the persistent session. We sort of emulate the persistence of that session because we don't want to, because Postgres connections and Postgres sessions are precious, and we want our pool to sort of load balance the work better, so that some things are emulated and they're not 100% perfect, as with vanilla Postgres, but there are a lot of things you can already do with the SQL interface. And if something doesn't work, let us know. We can look into it.
Yeah. Yeah, if you want documentation on that, it is in the reference section of our documentation site. There's a page, SQL support, that can tell you how to connect to that. And it's also got a list of clients that we've already tested it against. But if there's something you try and it doesn't work, file a bug and we can take a look at it. I think that's it for this week. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you, Elvis, for sharing all your wisdom and knowledge, as always.
Thank you.
Hope everybody has a great weekend, and we will talk to you next time. Thanks a lot for joining us.
See you guys.
Thanks.